It was an attack of unimaginable brutality.
It wasn't just a stabbing, it wasn't a shooting. It was slaughter.
The killing of a soldier on a busy London street signalled a new type of terrorism.
It was deliberately intended to be very selective. Kill one person in a very bloody fashion.
You wondered what sort of warped mind could not just think of doing that, but carry it out.
Not content with committing murder, the killers then boasted of their actions to the nation.
They almost, after carrying out the attack, seemed to pose for people, justifying the act of murder as a strike against the West, as a strike against Western foreign policy.
The senseless murder of Lee Rigby truly was a crime that shook Britain. The United Kingdom is no stranger to terrorism. From IRA bombs designed to kill and maim, to the Al-Qaeda-inspired attacks of July 7, 2005, that struck at the heart of the nation's capital.
Confronting extremism is a job for us all.
The British people have dealt with terrorism in all its forms.
Terrorism overall doesn't stay static, it changes. And the tactics and the methods change over time as well. And partly this is because of different groups are getting involved, but also partly it's a response to the security measures that the state introduces. What we find is that you get a switch to a different type of tactic, different type of target that is easier to hit.
The events in Woolwich on a normal spring day brought a stark new meaning to the term terrorist atrocity. It was shortly after 2 p.m. on the 22nd of May, and Londoners were going about their daily business.
First we was up at Plumstead Common in the shops, and I was looking for a council estate office, and we went to, I think it was Brewery Road, and that's not there. Then I said, oh no, it's going to be at Cholton, let's go Cholton. And Michelle just literally chose to drive that way. We rarely go that way. And literally we just turned left into Artillery Place, and there it was.
Tina Nimmo and her daughter were driving through southeast London when they happened upon a scene that would stay with them both forever.
Michelle saw more than me because she said, this is actually what she said, Mum, he shot him. And I literally looked and could see them, the two men, and a smashed up car and the body in front. And they were holding weapons, and particularly a gun, so I thought, well, that makes sense, they probably have. I got out of the car and said, has anybody called the police? And they said no. I said, call the police. And then I went over to them, to the assailants. I was shouting at them, and they were just continuing to hack at him, really, and kick him, and in victory, that's what they looked like, so elated at what they'd done. He was their prize. It was just awful, just awful.
Ingrid Loyo-Kennett was travelling on the number 53 bus through Woolwich on her way home, when she too arrived at the scene. Like everyone present, she was unsure exactly what she was witnessing.
I was sitting next to the window, and I noticed that there was a body on the ground, and there was a black guy pacing, a crash car in a pool, a Caribbean lady stroking the back of the victim. And I thought, okay, although the car was a bit too straight on the pavement, I thought road accident, nervous driver, thinking, oh my God, what have I done? And a lovely lady comforting somebody, waiting for the ambulance, so he's not dead. So I'm thinking, okay, I've done some first aid and I knew that his position was wrong. So I went out of the bus and approached the victim, and I was down. He didn't look really hurt. I mean, it was really strange. There was no blood, there was no broken limb. And take his pulse, and I couldn't feel any. And the lady said, he's dead.
Elsewhere, across London, the news of the incident was beginning to spread.
It was an afternoon in May, and it was, I think, reasonably sunny. And just around about 2 to 2:30, they started to come through some fairly incoherent news about something happening in southeast London. It was that odd, modern mix of tweets, social media, some sparse detail from the authorities about some sort of incident happening, and the tweets seemed, frankly, unbelievable. Talk about very violent scenes of somebody being decapitated, of shots being fired. So it was a very tricky and muddled picture at the start.
Back at the scene, on John Wilson Street in Woolwich, the full horror of what had happened was becoming evident to the passers-by. They could see a body surrounded by two men who were holding knives covered in blood.
I think for other people coming at that stage, they thought that he had been run over. That's what you'd presume, because he was in the middle of the road, the car was smashed up round the post. Yeah, I'd presume that too. Nobody realises, the people that came later, the severity of what had just happened, what we'd just witnessed, them chopping him up.
His head was covered with his jacket, so I was going to leave the jacket when I heard a voice saying, "Don't touch the body."
Faced with this order, Ingrid turned to see who had spoken to her.
His hand was carrying a revolver, the other one a butcher's knife and a meat cleaver, and all covered with blood. And I thought, okay, we have a situation here, it's not a car accident. So I thought, okay, I'm going to talk to him. And so hop, I was standing up and look at him and make sure I was not higher than him. So he would dominate the situation at all time. So I look at him and say, why? I say, because the British Army is killing civilians in Muslim countries.
It seemed pretty unbelievable, but as the afternoon wore on, fairly soon there started to be a sense or a couple of contacts saying this might be more than just a regular crime. You need to look at a possible terrorist motive, or we think there might be a possible terrorist motive. And you can almost plot a graph on the seriousness of a story, and this one just rose and rose and rose and rose.
At approximately 2:20 this afternoon, police officers were called to an assault in John Wilson Street, Woolwich, where one man was being assaulted by two other men.
As the afternoon wore on, facts about what happened began to emerge, and more importantly, who the victim was. His name was Fusilier drummer Lee Rigby. A 25-year-old father, Lee Rigby was a soldier from the Royal Regiment of Fusiliers, based at the nearby Royal Artillery Barracks. His attackers were two young British men, Michael Adebolajo and Michael Adebowale. Having identified their target, they drove their car into the soldier, knocking him over before attacking him with knives in a frenzied attack.
They were determined they wanted to kill a soldier, and Lee Rigby had been at a recruitment fair at the Tower of London, and he was coming back wearing a Help for Heroes sweatshirt and a bag which Adebolajo in his police interview said they identified as being army issue. And he was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. As Adebolajo said in his police interview when asked why they picked on that particular soldier, quotes, "It just so happened that he was the soldier that was spotted first," end quote. It could have been any other of those based at the Woolwich barracks. It just happened to be Lee Rigby.
Lee Rigby had crossed Wellington Road on his way home to his barracks. He had been spotted by Adebolajo and Adebowale, who put their barbaric plan into operation.
Planning for the attack seems to be fairly short. They bought knives the day before from an Argos shop in Lewisham in South London. They used everyday items, almost impossible to stop the wrong people buying, to inflict an attack that caused such devastation for the Rigby family and such concern for security officials in the United Kingdom. The day of the attack, the two men met up over at a flat in South London, then got into a car and drove around the barracks in Woolwich looking for a soldier to attack. They happened upon Lee Rigby by chance, and then they set about him.
I kept looking at them thinking, you're not mad. You're not mad. You're not drugged up. They just looked calm. And they just continued to do what they were doing. And nobody could have stopped them. This was a slaughter. It wasn't just a stabbing, it wasn't a shooting. It was slaughter. He didn't stand a chance.
The assailants deliberately drove the car into Lee Rigby, and as he lay wounded on the pavement, attacked him with knives before dragging his body into the middle of the road.
Usually with murders, it's a heat of the moment thing. You know, somebody will stab once, twice, a few times. This was almost like they were toying with the corpse. You wondered what sort of warped mind could not just think of doing that, but carry it out.
Contrary to everyone's expectations, once they had finished mutilating their victim, the attackers remained at the scene.
It's a very odd scene, and these were very odd attackers. What we'd been used to before was those motivated by the Al-Qaeda ideology, wanting to kill as many people as possible. So on July 7th, in fact, there was arguably some disappointment because they thought the tube trains would catch fire and there'd be even more casualties. Here, once they attacked their poor victim, they really didn't do anything else. They had ample opportunity to attack other people. They didn't. They chatted. They seemed proud of what they had done.
What came next would become one of the most defining images of the entire tragedy. Lee Rigby was murdered in Woolwich on the 22nd of May, 2013. His attackers, Michael Adebolajo and Michael Adebowale, had run him over with their car before hacking at his body with knives.
It's pretty clear that what's happened tonight in Woolwich is a sickening and unforgivable act of violence.
Immediately after killing him, the pair remained at the scene and began talking to onlookers, who incredibly began filming them.
We're willing to speak to people and engage with people around them. This isn't what people expected, but you have this footage of them talking to the camera in detail as they waited for the police to arrive. There was no effort to escape. It was basically waiting at the scene, talking to people, trying to get their message across. Of course, it's very graphic, it's very gory, and again, that, in media terms, that just means that it's going to be watched even more.
I apologise that women had to witness this today, but in our land, our women have to see the same. You people will never be safe. Remove your governments, they don't care about you. Do you think...
They get their message across. Everyone knows what the story is pretty much by day one, and that this isn't a serial killer or a knife maniac. It's basically a terrorist attack.
Tell them to bring our troops back so you can all live in peace. Leave our lands and you will live in peace. That's all I have to say.
For me, it was the barbaric reality of terrorism on our land, on British soil. And I think that is going to be, it's left an indelible print societally, Muslims and non-Muslims.
The feel of it, the content of it, absolutely in keeping with Al-Qaeda inspired speeches.
Islam clearly defines the parameters for warfare and the environment for warfare and the circumstance around which it's enacted. And yet again, you'll see that the extremists will bring these texts and distort them to justify that while he was on home ground, the fact that he was a soldier therefore gave extended legitimacy for them to carry out that attack.
When you dig into it, it's actually a very sophisticated attack and very successful. I mean, this was an incredibly successful attack in terms of one person was killed, which obviously there are far more lethal attacks out there, but it got a huge amount of media coverage.
Newsrooms are very busy places, and it's rare that everything stops, but everything stopped. It's rare that if you've been a reporter covering some difficult stuff, that your jaw drops, but your jaw just dropped for so many reasons.
As pictures from the scene were beamed live to the nation's TV screens, the sense of disbelief about what happened continued to grow, compounded by the attackers' claims that they were brave soldiers engaged in a holy war.
They're not brave, they weren't brave men. They came at him from behind with a car. That's not brave, is it? So then they run him over first to get him down. He must have been in such a state when they've already done him, and then they choose to chop him up. That's not brave men, is it? Done him from behind. No, I'm sorry, they're not brave men.
My understanding is, even for people who are trained professionals, you have a heightened level of, stress, anxiety after something like that. He was coherent. This wasn't somebody who was mad. This was somebody who was coherent. He's carried out this act just minutes beforehand, and he's taking in politeness, in terms of, I apologise to all these people, they had to see this. He's taking in a bit of geopolitics. He's taking in a bit of a potted history of the West and Islam as he sees it. And it's a fairly coherent speech.
The killers of Lee Rigby, seemingly satisfied that their message was out there, remained at the scene, waiting. And whilst this would suggest the attackers were working out what to do next, it was actually a very well thought out plan.
This is a deceptive attack in many respects because it looks so crude, almost like it could have happened purely at random, that they were driving along and he was just in the wrong place at the wrong day and got these guys in the wrong mood. But it's actually much more sophisticated than that. We need to kind of look at this attack at a number of different levels, and one level is to bear in mind the failures, the long list of failures that Al-Qaeda-inspired terrorism has had in the UK, where sometimes very sophisticated, very ambitious plots, and very clever plots have failed, repeatedly failed. And one of the key lessons from that was simple is best. And what we see here is the personification of that lesson.
The days of crashing an airplane into the Twin Towers or multiple bomb attacks on the capital's transport system, they aren't over, but they're even more difficult for the terrorists to pull off than they were then, because the authorities have had more experience in how these attacks were pulled off.
And what we have with this attack was a deliberate decision to go for very simple weapons and use these weapons to carry out the attack. It was deliberately intended to be very selective. Kill one person in a very bloody fashion, using the car to knock him down, run him over, and then kill him with the knives.
Adebolajo and Adebowale expected that they would be confronted after carrying out their murder by armed police and by soldiers. In fact, one of the women at the scene asked them if they're going to harm the people who are watching all this unfold. And Adebolajo says, quotes, "No, the women and children are safe. You need to keep back when the police and the soldiers get here," end quote.
They deliberately know that the police are not going to intervene immediately because they're going to have to wait for armed officers. And so that means you're going to have 10, 15 minutes at least while you're waiting for armed officers. And in theory, they could have attacked members of the public during this time. They could have just gone after anyone who was there, but they don't do that. And so you have the conversations with the bystanders, you have them talking to people, allowing themselves to be filmed.
Back at the scene, confusion reigned, with many passers-by seemingly unaware of what exactly had happened. Tina Nimmo had remained on John Wilson Street, keeping vehicles clear of Lee Rigby's body and waiting for the authorities.
It felt like 15 to 20 minutes before the police came. It felt like we were dealing with that whole situation on our own for that amount of time. One of the occasions when I was down the bottom road seeing the traffic along, I heard the siren. And I looked and they were coming and I just called them round, really. I was just showing them this is where it is. And they literally came in, diagonal.
What they were wanting was not that they intended to harm the armed police, but that they wanted the armed police to shoot them dead so they would become martyrs.
Once the police arrive, then this is the final stage of the attack from their point of view, And remarkably, in this case, I think the police are very restrained and they don't shoot them dead.
I've never heard a gun, not at that close quarters, and there was plenty of shots. And actually, when they hit the ground, the two men, I felt elated. Absolutely elated, because they were not in control anymore of that situation, and we had help then.
Both Adebolajo and Adebowale were shot by armed officers and incapacitated. Their desire to become martyrs had been denied.
Once the two men were down, we were sort of mobbed by loads of plainclothes police officers saying, "Get away, move on, move on, get out." And I said, "Tell you what, mate, you can fuck right off." I said, "Because I've just been doing your job for the last 15, 20 minutes. And they sort of said, "Oh shit, you're witnesses." "Yes, we are. Can you stay where you are?" And then we were taken away a bit later. But I remember when we went in the police car and Lee was still exposed. He wasn't covered or anything. And I remember just looking back and rest in peace. And that was it, really.
Adebolajo and Adebowale were taken to hospital, and whilst officers waited to question them, the investigation began into their background and what led two young British men to commit one of the most appalling attacks the country had ever seen. 25-year-old soldier Lee Rigby was killed in May 2013 when he was attacked by two men in Woolwich, southeast London. The nation's sympathy went out to his devastated family.
Lee's dream of growing up was always to join the army, which he succeeded in doing. He was dedicated and loved his job. Lee adored and cared a lot for his family, and he was very much a family man.
The two assailants were shot and wounded by armed police shortly after the attack. And whilst they recovered in hospital, the intelligence services began to piece together the path that led to Lee Rigby's brutal murder.
In both cases, there's long histories of involvement in extremist ideology and extremist activity. And they were involved in protests, taking part in demonstrations, involved in various extreme movements for a long time. And they were on the scene for a long time. And I think one of the questions with this case in particular is why wasn't there a closer eye kept on them?
Michael Adebolajo was 29, a married father of 6 children, his youngest born just 4 days prior to the murder. His accomplice in the plot, Michael Adebowale, was 22.
They're from pretty much professional parent backgrounds. They were reasonable levels of education. They were just got by this ideology, and through a mix of what they were told Islam was, through a mix of how they interpreted the world, their place in the world, and their own personalities and their own mental states, convinced themselves that carrying out this act in broad daylight, doing what they did to another human being, not only was something they should do, but was something they thought would please God.
They genuinely see themselves as soldiers fighting a war. They do not see themselves as criminals, and they do not see themselves as psychopaths. They see themselves as soldiers fighting a war, engaged in a, from their particular point of view, a struggle between good and evil. And this is a genuine belief.
Adebolajo was the dominant of the two attackers. He was born in Romford. His family were Nigerians. He was originally born a Christian. His father worked in the NHS. He got into some trouble as a teenager. His family moved out of London in an attempt to lessen the dangers of that to him. Like his accomplice, Adebowale is from a Christian Nigerian background and later converts to Islam. His family were relatively middle class. His dad worked for the Nigerian High Commission. His mum was a probation worker. He was brought up in Greenwich, southeast London. He has some trouble with the law when he's a teenager. He serves just over a year for drugs offences. And he does seem to be going off the rails in his sort of mid to late teens.
As youngsters, both Adebolajo and Adebowale became involved in London's gang culture, itself a potential breeding ground for extremism.
There is a correlation between the gang violence and violent extremism or violent radicalisation. And when you look at the messages of Abu Hamza, Abdul El Faisal, and who they were targeting individuals from these sorts of backgrounds.
What does a gang provide a member? A sense of identity, sense of belonging, group support, self-esteem, all of these things. And this is crucial for gangs in order to recruit people and hold on to people. And the same is very much applies with terrorist groups and terrorist causes. It provides all of these benefits to members.
When you say that robbing and stealing is something that can further a particular cause towards their perception of jihad, these individuals find this now what was once criminalised, what was once frowned upon, things that they would be incarcerated for are now meritorious according to the distorted tenets of Islam that these individuals preach. My colleagues who knew Michael Adebolajo, they said he was a very polite individual when they first knew him, very articulate in his speaking.
As they grew up, both Adebolajo and Adebowale were drawn further into the world of violent extremism and radical preachers.
Adebolajo went to Greenwich University and ended up dropping out. He came across figures who featured in the radicalisation of other alleged terrorists, namely Omar Bakri Mohammed and Anjem Chowdhury. There was a group called Al-Mujahirun, which they were involved with, and Adebolajo attended meetings and talks in and around that group. Essentially, this would be what most people would see as the more extreme Islamist interpretation of the religion.
Michael Adebolajo began to surround himself with radical clerics who preached a twisted version of Islam. And, as a consequence of this, his extremist feelings grew stronger.
There was an incident that occurred in Tooting, for example, where Michael Adebolajo saw an individual wearing a Palestinian scarf, a drunk individual, and he took issue with that and attacked the individual. And his justification was that he's making a mockery of the religion. So that preceded what happened in Woolwich. This is not representative of Islam in any shape or form. The vast majority of Muslims do not subscribe to the extremist rhetoric and distorted, warped understanding of his murderers, and that the majority, if not the vast majority, I would say, of Muslims in this society are proud to be Muslim, British, and participating in this particular society.
Adebolajo had converted to Islam, and his understanding of the religion would have been shaped by the extremist group Al-Mujahirun. The name he chose for himself when he converted didn't exactly do himself any favours. He chose the name Mujahid Abu Hamza, literally one who engages in jihad. He was involved in their protests, he was photographed leading protests and taking part in protests and making speeches. And then he decides he wants to go to Kenya, which is the gateway to Somalia. Somalia essentially is a ungoverned state. There are big, lawless areas, and terrorists who have an affinity to the Al-Qaeda ideology have set up around that area.
Prior to travelling to Kenya, it appears that Adebolajo was contacted by the British security services, who tried to persuade him to inform on the other members of the extremist groups he was now a part of. He refused, and in autumn 2010, Adebolajo left for Africa.
When we look at Michael's effort to travel overseas and get involved in a conflict, again, we need to, again, keep returning to this view that the individuals have of themselves. And the view is very much, I am a soldier fighting a war. And what do soldiers do? As, soldiers fight. They get a gun and they go and they get involved in serious gunfights, serious battles, and they prove themselves in that way. And this is one of the reasons why, for example, Al-Qaeda traditionally has struggled to get people to stay in the UK, because they all want to go overseas and get involved in what they see as the real war and the real fighting. And he was blocked from doing that.
He ends up being picked up by the Kenyan authorities. He ends up in the dock alongside some people with some quite heavy-duty connections to those involved in violence over there. Ends up leaving Kenya, coming back to Britain.
What emerged in the months after Lee Rigby's murder was the fact that the security services knew about Adebolajo's arrest in Kenya, and questions still remain as to if he was indeed a threat. Why wasn't a closer watch kept on him? What is clear, however, is the state of mind of Adebolajo on his return to Britain.
This, I think, for him was a huge source of frustration. It may also have been a source of embarrassment, because he may have told people, I'm going overseas and I'm going to take part in jihad. I've been talking about it for years and years and years, and now finally I'm actually going to do something. And now he was going to have to return, having achieved nothing. From his point of view, that gave him no choice. That if he wanted to do something, it was going to have to be in the UK. And that's exactly what happened.
Whilst the two men were by this stage guided by the principles of jihad, or holy war, another event early in Adebowale's life clearly affected him.
One absolutely astonishing thing that emerged after the murder of Lee Rigby was that Adebowale himself, when a teenager, had witnessed a horrific murder of a friend of his, where the victim was literally cut to ribbons by the assailant. And I don't know what sort of effect that would have on a teenager, but I can't imagine it was anything other than pretty damaging.
By the middle of June 2013, both Adebowale and Adebolajo were released from hospital and charged with Lee Rigby's murder.
The most humane way to kill any creature is to cut the jugular. He may be my enemy, but he is a man. So I struck at the neck and attempted to remove the head. End quote.
Their cold-hearted descriptions of their actions would stun everyone who heard them. "29-year-old Michael Adebolajo and 22-year-old Michael Adebowale were both charged with murder after they had killed soldier Lee Rigby in a barbaric attack in broad daylight on a South London street. Shot and wounded by armed police at the scene, the pair had been treated in hospital and assessed to determine if they were mentally fit to stand trial.
Adebowale had mental health problems, and in hearings before the jury sat, we heard that he had effects from that attack he witnessed at the age of 16. He still heard the voice of his attacker. He had also problems associated with the use of skunk, a more potent form of cannabis, which had left him with additional mental health problems. He heard sometimes voices. He talked in his assessments about hearing spirits called jinns. So he had pretty clear mental health problems, but was still responsible for his actions. Adebolajo, on the other hand, the more dominant of the two, is assessed to be absolutely sane. No history of mental health illness, no family history of any mental health problems, assessed to be completely sane.
An incident just prior to the attack on Lee Rigby gave an unnerving glimpse into the mind of the man prosecutors would claim to be the ringleader of the shocking plot.
They meet up on the day of the attack at about 8:30ish, 9:15, at I think Adebowale's flat in Greenwich, and then they drive around in the car and they need some petrol. It's Adebolajo you see on the CCTV. He goes into the Tesco, hasn't got enough money, so I think leaves his mobile phone as security. Goes and gets some money, comes back 15 minutes later, keeps his word. Gets his mobile phone back, goes off, heads towards Woolwich barracks, starts hunting for prey. In his case, a soldier.
When interviewed by detectives, Adebolajo provided a chilling insight into his state of mind.
He claimed he'd carried it out as a soldier of Allah. He was dressed in a light blue blanket because he felt cold in the cells at Southwark Police Station.
So we sat in wait, and it just so happened that he was the soldier that was spotted first.
He said, quotes, "It was almost as if Allah had chosen him. When I thought about obeying Allah in the past, I thought maybe it is possible to kill a man by driving into him. When he crossed the road in front of me, it was almost as if I was not in control of myself. I accelerated, I hit him, and I think I crashed into a signpost. We wished to fulfill our promise to Allah. We did not wish to give him much pain. I could see he was still alive. We exited the vehicle and I am not sure how I struck the first blow. The most humane way to kill any creature is to cut the jugular. He may be my enemy, but he is a man. So I struck at the neck and attempted to remove the head." End quote. He's detailing this deeply, deeply twisted act in a very calm and rational voice, the way I've seen other people describe a recipe. It's almost without feeling, almost without adequate connection to the acts he has carried out.
I think all terrorists try to dehumanize their targets. And we see this across a whole range of groups and a whole range of years. And dehumanizing your target is incredibly important because it's very, very difficult to hurt people if you see them as an individual, as somebody with a family, as somebody with children, friends, a life. And so what you find with terrorists is that they work very hard to dehumanize them, so you don't see the person. Instead, you see what they represent.
After weeks of assessment, it was confirmed that Adebolajo and Adebowale were fit to stand trial. Proceedings began in November 2013 at the Old Bailey in London.
This was almost certainly the most overwhelming case in English criminal history. Not only did you have it all witnessed by human beings, not only did you have confessions, but you also had virtually every part of it caught on video. It was absolutely overwhelming.
We'd been on a visit to the court and we knew exactly where everybody was going to be sitting. So I knew where they were in relation to where I was. And I think my daughter and I both found it really hard to think that we'd have to go to court and relive our experience with his mum and dad there and his family, because we didn't want to put them through that. Felt like we were inflicting that pain on them, but actually the police already told us that they're fully informed of what happened. So that sort of takes the burden off you a little bit. You're okay to say how it was. That's very hard.
When we look at the trial, the two were very clear in portraying themselves as soldiers. And so we see this not guilty defense that, you know, yes, we killed somebody, but we killed a soldier. We killed him because we're engaged in a war, and he's a soldier and we're soldiers, so therefore that's not murder, that's war.
Michael Adebolajo and Michael Adebowale have pleaded not guilty to murdering Lee Rigby. They also deny the attempted murder of a police officer and conspiracy to murder a police officer.
And I think that defence is, for me, completely consistent with how they see themselves. They genuinely do see themselves as soldiers.
They wanted their day in court, especially Michael Adebolajo, who wanted to express their beliefs and who they are and the rationale for why they were doing what they were doing. They needed to do that, even though they knew that it wasn't going to be accepted.
The court listened to over 3 weeks of harrowing evidence, detailing exactly what had happened on that May afternoon in Woolwich. Outside the court, far-right groups gathered in protest, calling for the death penalty to be reinstated and chanting racist slogans. On the 19th of December, the jury returned a unanimous verdict. 29-year-old Adebolajo and Adebowale, who was 22, were both found guilty of murdering Lee Rigby.
I felt, when they were guilty, elated, actually. Elated. There couldn't have been any other outcome, really.
Whilst the two guilty men remained calm during the verdicts, when it came to the sentencing 2 months later, their reaction was markedly different.
Adebolajo, the ringleader, got a whole life term, meaning he'll never, ever be freed. He will die in jail. Adebowale got a 45-year minimum sentence. That's 45 years before he'll be ever considered for release. The two of them had been relatively well behaved during the trial, but at sentencing they completely lost it. Mr. Justice Sweeney, he was sentencing them. The point where they lost it was when they were accused of, far from being, soldiers for Allah, they in fact had betrayed Islam by their actions. And at that point, I think it was Adebowale was the first one to kick off, shouting, "That's lies." And he was agitated and shouting more, and eventually Adebolajo joined in. And the judge said to them, I seem to remember his exact words were, "Gentlemen, you have a choice." And then they kicked off even more, and the struggle broke out with, I think, the 9 or 10 security guards in the dock, and they ended up being carried out, at least one of them head first, through the dock, down the steps which lead to the cells.
Today, the Rigby family welcomes the whole life and significant sentences that have been passed down on Lee's killers.
They should never be out again. Never ever. I understand people say people can change. Yeah, okay, whatever. I wouldn't even take a chance on them changing. They've done what they've done. They've told us they've done it. They've put their hands up to it. Their time's up, mate. That's the end of that. He hasn't got a life, and nor should they have.
Well, the whole country was completely shocked by the murder of Lee Rigby, and the whole country united in condemnation of what happened, and I'm sure everyone will welcome these verdicts today.
There wasn't going to be any remorse or sorrow from these extremist elements. Once extremism's ideology takes root in this way, and it's been allowed to foment in this way, there's no surprise beyond what happened in the courtroom after that.
The killing of Lee Rigby was designed to divide Britain, to turn the population against each other. In this respect, it failed, and communities united in the fight against extremism. Despite this, the shocking events of the 22nd of May 2013 will stay with those who witnessed them forever.
People are expecting us to just move on now. I understand that, but we can't. It just isn't as simple as that. There's something there that when you choose not to think about it, but it comes to you, and your head fills up with the whole scenario. How can you move on from that? I see things that no one should have to see, and it's all there in my head.
When the two were convicted, there's this strange thing. Usually the family of a murder victim are taken away in cars. They walked out the Old Bailey. A group of them, led by a stepdad, just walked down the street where the court is, turned right, walked along that street, then turned left down to sort of Blackfriars and the river. It's almost like now these two have been convicted and behind bars. We want to show we're not afraid to walk the streets of our capital. We're not going to be cowed by this. We're not going to be intimidated by this. We are going to walk our streets in broad daylight and feel safe.
It's been a garrison for many years, and in actual fact we've probably got so much pride in the borough, in our armed forces, and I think we should have. And for that to happen, it's an absolute insult, I think. And we could drive past the common, we see the soldiers walking about in all their gear on, their uniform, and they've never been bothered. And it's actually feel quite proud, but not anymore. It doesn't feel like that. If I see a soldier with his gear on, I think, go and take it off, because you're going to be identified.
These are ostensibly ordinary kids, ordinary young males, and they don't have horns, smell of sulphur, They look like somebody else, somebody you pass in the street every day, and that makes it all the more chilling. It's their ordinariness, it's their fact that you were aware that they were probably reasonably well brought up, if not very well brought up, yet this happened to them. This happened to their minds, this happened to their souls, where they got to a position where they could do this, where they could even think it and carry it out and be proud of it.